During World War I, the German Empire was one of the Central Powers that lost the war. It began participation with the conflict after the declaration of war against Serbia by its ally, Austria-Hungary. German forces fought the Allies on both the eastern and western fronts. Although German territory itself remained relatively safe from widespread invasion for most of the war, except for a brief period in 1914 when East Prussia was invaded. A tight blockade imposed by the Royal Navy caused severe food shortages in the cities, especially in the winter of 1916–17, known as the Turnip Winter. Overview. The German population responded to the outbreak of war in 1914 with a complex mix of emotions. In a similar way to the populations in other countries of Europe, notions of overt enthusiasm known as the spirit of 1914 have been challenged by more recent scholarship. The German government, dominated by the Junkers, thought of the war as a way to end Germany's disputes with rivals France, Russia and Britain. The beginning of war was presented in authoritarian Germany as the chance for the nation to secure "our place under the sun," as the foreign minister, Bernhard von Bülow, had put it, which was readily supported by prevalent nationalism among the public. The Kaiser and the German establishment hoped the war would unite the public behind the monarchy, and lessen the threat posed by the dramatic growth of the Social Democratic Party of Germany, which had been the most vocal critic of the Kaiser in the Reichstag before the war. Despite its membership in the Second International, the Social Democratic Party of Germany ended its differences with the imperial government and abandoned its principles of internationalism to support the war effort. It soon became apparent that Germany was not prepared for a war lasting more than a few months. At first, little was done to regulate the economy for a wartime footing, and the German war economy would remain badly organized throughout the war. Germany depended on imports of food and raw materials, which were stopped by the British blockade of Germany. Food prices were first limited, then rationing was introduced. The winter of 1916–17 was called Turnip Winter because the potato harvest was poor and people ate animal feed including vile-tasting turnips. During the war from August 1914 to mid-1919, the excess deaths over peacetime caused by malnutrition and high rates of exhaustion and disease and despair came to about 474,000 civilians. 1914–15. The German army opened the war on the Western Front with a modified version of the Schlieffen Plan, designed to quickly attack France through neutral Belgium before turning southwards to encircle the French army on the German border. The Belgians fought back and sabotaged their rail system to delay the Germans. The Germans did not expect this and were delayed, and responded with systematic reprisals on civilians, killing nearly 6,000 Belgian non-combatants, including women and children, and burning 25,000 houses and buildings. The plan called for the right flank of the German advance to converge on Paris, and initially, the Germans were very successful, particularly in the Battle of the Frontiers. By the 12th of September, the French with assistance from the British forces halted the German advance east of Paris at the First Battle of the Marne. The last days of this battle signified the end of mobile warfare in the West. The French offensive into Germany, launched on the 7th of August with the Battle of Mulhouse, had limited success. In the east, only one field army defended East Prussia, and when Russia attacked in this region it diverted German forces intended for the Western Front. Germany defeated Russia in a series of battles collectively known as the First Battle of Tannenberg. But this diversion exacerbated problems of insufficient speed of advance from railheads not foreseen by the German General Staff. The Central Powers were thereby denied a quick victory, and forced to fight a war on two fronts. The German army had fought its way into a good defensive position inside France and had permanently incapacitated 230,000 more French and British troops than it had lost itself. Despite this, communications problems and questionable command decisions cost Germany the chance of obtaining an early victory. 1916 was characterized by two great battles on the Western Front, at Verdun and Somme. They each lasted most of the year, achieved minimal gains, and drained away the best soldiers of both sides. Verdun became the iconic symbol of the murderous power of modern defensive weapons, with 280,000 German casualties, and 315,000 French. At Somme, there were over 400,000 German casualties, against over 600,000 Allied casualties. At Verdun, the Germans attacked what they considered to be a weak French salient which nevertheless the French would defend for reasons of national pride. The Somme was a part of a multinational plan of the Allies to attack on different fronts simultaneously. German woes were also compounded by Russia's Grand Brusilov offensive, where although Germany suffered less than their allies with 150,000 of the 770,000 Central Powers casualties, were simultaneous to the Somme offensive and with Germany already committed to the Verdun offensive. German experts are divided in their interpretation of the Somme. Some say it was a standoff, but most see it as a British victory and argue it marks the point at which German morale began a permanent decline and the strategic initiative was lost, along with irreplaceable veterans and confidence. 1917. Enthusiasm faded with the enormous numbers of casualties, the dwindling supply of manpower, the mounting difficulties on the home front, and the never-ending flow of casualty reports. A grimmer and grimmer attitude began to prevail amongst the general population. Morale was helped by victories against Serbia, Greece, Italy, and Russia, which made great gains for the Central Powers. Morale was at its greatest since 1914, at the end of 1917 and beginning of 1918 with the defeat of Russia following her rise into revolution, and the German people braced for what Ludendorff said would be the peace offensive in the West. 1918. In spring 1918, Germany realized that time was running out. It prepared for the decisive strike with new armies and new tactics, hoping to win the war on the Western Front before millions of American soldiers appeared in battle. General Erich Ludendorff and Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg had full control of the army. They had a large supply of reinforcements moved from the Eastern Front, and they trained stormtroopers with new tactics to race through the trenches and attack the enemy's command and communications centers. The new tactics would indeed restore mobility to the Western Front, but the German army was too optimistic. During the winter of 1917-18 it was quiet on the Western Front. British casualties averaged only 3,000 a week. Serious attacks were impossible in the winter because of the deep caramel-thick mud. Quietly the Germans brought in the best soldiers from the Eastern Front, selected elite stormtroops, and trained them all winter in the new tactics. With stopwatch timing, the German artillery would lay down a sudden, fearsome barrage just ahead of its advancing infantry. Moving in small units, firing light machine guns, the stormtroopers would bypass enemy strongpoints, and head directly for critical bridges, command posts, supply dumps and, above all, artillery batteries. By cutting enemy communications they would paralyze response in the critical first half hour. By silencing the artillery they would break the enemy's firepower. Rigid schedules sent in 2 more waves of infantry to mop up the strong points that had been bypassed. The shock troops frightened and disoriented the first line of defenders, who would flee in panic. In one instance an easygoing Allied regiment broke and fled. Reinforcements rushed in on bicycles. The panicky men seized the bikes and beat an even faster retreat. The stormtrooper tactics provided mobility, but not increased firepower. Eventually, in 1939 and 1940, the formula would be perfected with the aid of dive bombers and tanks, but in 1918 the Germans lacked both. Ludendorff erred by attacking the British first in 1918, instead of the French. He mistakenly thought the British to be too uninspired to respond rapidly to the new tactics. The exhausted, dispirited French perhaps might have folded. The German assaults on the British were ferocious, the largest of the entire war. At the Somme River in March, 63 divisions attacked in a blinding fog. No matter, the German lieutenants had memorized their maps and their orders. The British lost 270,000 men, fell back 40 miles, and then held. They quickly learned how to handle the new German tactics. Fall back, abandon the trenches, let the attackers overextend themselves, and then counterattack. They gained an advantage in firepower from their artillery and from tanks used as mobile pillboxes that could retreat and counterattack at will. In April, Ludendorff hit the British again, inflicting 305,000 casualties, but he lacked the reserves to follow up. Ludendorff launched 5 great attacks between March and July, inflicting 1 million British and French casualties. The Western Front now had opened up. The trenches were still there, but the importance of mobility now reasserted itself. The Allies held. The Germans suffered as many casualties as they inflicted, including most of their precious stormtroopers. The new German replacements were underaged youth or embittered middle-aged family men in poor condition. They were not inspired by the élan of 1914, nor thrilled with battle. They hated it, and soon began talking of revolution. Ludendorff could not replace his losses, nor could he devise a new brainstorm that might somehow snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. The British likewise were bringing in boys and men aged 50, but since their home front was in good condition, and since they could see the Americans arriving steadily, their morale was higher. The Great German Spring Offensive was a race against time, for everyone could see the Americans were training millions of fresh young men who would eventually arrive on the Western Front. The attrition warfare now caught up to both sides. Germany had used up all the best soldiers they had, and still had not conquered much territory. The British were out of fresh manpower, the French nearly so. Berlin had calculated it would take months for the Americans to ship all their men and supplies, but the U.S. troops arrived much sooner, as they left their supplies behind, and relied on British and French artillery, tanks, airplanes, trucks and equipment. Berlin also assumed that Americans were fat, undisciplined and unaccustomed to hardship and severe fighting. They soon realized their mistake. The Germans reported that the qualities of the Americans individually may be described as remarkable. They are physically well set up, their attitude is good. They lack at present only training and experience to make formidable adversaries. The men are in fine spirits and are filled with naive assurance. By September 1918, the Central Powers were exhausted from fighting, and the American forces were pouring into France at a rate of 10,000 a day. The decisive Allied counter-offensive, known as the 100 Days Offensive, began on the 8th of August 1918, what Ludendorff called the Black Day of the German Army. The Allied armies advanced steadily as German defenses faltered. Although German armies were still on enemy soil as the war ended, the generals, the civilian leadership, and indeed the soldiers and the people, knew all was hopeless. They started looking for scapegoats. The hunger and popular dissatisfaction with the war precipitated revolution throughout Germany. By the 11th of November, Germany had virtually surrendered, the Kaiser and all the royal families had abdicated, and the empire had been replaced by the Weimar Republic. Home front. War fever. The spirit of 1914 was the overwhelming, enthusiastic support of all elements of the population for war in 1914. In the Reichstag, the vote for credits was unanimous, with all the socialists joining in. One professor testified to a great single feeling of moral elevation, of soaring of religious sentiment, in short, the ascent of a whole people to the heights. At the same time, there was a level of anxiety. Most commentators predicted the short victorious war, but that hope was dashed in a matter of weeks, as the invasion of Belgium bogged down and the French army held in front of Paris. The Western Front became a killing machine, as neither army moved more than a few hundred yards at a time. Industry in late 1914 was in chaos. Unemployment soared while it took months to reconvert to munitions productions. Church bells and copper roofs were ripped out and melted down. Economy: Germany had no plans for mobilizing its civilian economy for the war effort, and no stockpiles of food or critical supplies had been made. Germany had to improvise rapidly. All major political sectors supported the war, at least at first, including the socialists. Early in the war, industrialist Walter Rathenau held senior posts in the raw materials department of the War Ministry, while becoming chairman of AEG upon his father's death in 1915. Rathenau played the key role in convincing the War Ministry to set up the War Raw Materials Department. He was in charge of it from August 1914 to March 1915 and established the basic policies and procedures. His senior staff were on loan from industry. KRA focused on raw materials threatened by the British blockade, as well as supplies from occupied Belgium and France. It set prices and regulated the distribution to vital war industries. It began the development of ersatz raw materials. KRA suffered many inefficiencies caused by the complexity and selfishness KRA encountered from commerce, industry, and the government. While the KRA handled critical raw materials, the crisis over food supplies grew worse. The mobilization of so many farmers and horses, and the shortages of fertilizer, steadily reduced the food supply. Prisoners of war were sent to work on farms, and many women and elderly men took on work roles. Supplies that had once come in from Russia and Austria were cut off. The concept of total war in World War I meant that food supplies had to be redirected towards the armed forces, and with German commerce being stopped by the British blockade, German civilians were forced to live in increasingly meager conditions. Food prices were first controlled. Bread rationing was introduced in 1915 and worked well. The cost of bread fell. Allen says there were no signs of starvation in states. The sense of domestic catastrophe one gains from most accounts of food rationing in Germany is exaggerated. However, Howard argues that hundreds of thousands of civilians died from malnutrition, usually from a typhus or a disease their weakened body could not resist. Conditions deteriorated rapidly on the home front, with severe food shortages reported in all urban areas. The causes involved the transfer of so many farmers and food workers into the military, combined with the overburdened railroad system, shortages of coal, and the British blockade that cut off imports from abroad. The winter of 1916–1917 was known as the turnip winter, because that hardly edible vegetable, usually fed to livestock, was used by people as a substitute for potatoes and meat, which were increasingly scarce. Thousands of soup kitchens were open to feed the hungry people, who grumbled that the farmers were keeping the food for themselves. Even the army had to cut the rations for soldiers. Morale of both civilians and soldiers continued to sink. The drafting of miners reduced the main energy source, coal. The textile factories produced army uniforms, and warm clothing for civilians ran short. The device of using ersatz materials, such as paper and cardboard for cloth and leather, proved unsatisfactory. Soap was in short supply, as was hot water. All the cities reduced tram services, cut back on street lighting, and closed down theaters and cabarets. The food supply increasingly focused on potatoes and bread. It was harder and harder to buy meat. The meat ration in late 1916 was only 31% of peacetime, and it fell to 12% in late 1918. The fish ration was 51% in 1916, and none at all by late 1917. The rations for cheese, butter, rice, cereals, eggs and lard were less than 20% of peacetime levels. In 1917 the harvest was poor all across Europe, and the potato supply ran short. and Germans substituted almost inedible turnips. The turnip winter of 1916–17 was remembered with bitter distaste for generations. Early in the war introduced bread rationing, and the system worked fairly well, albeit with shortfalls during the turnip winter and summer of 1918. White bread used imported flour and became unavailable, but there was enough rye or rye potato flour to provide a minimal diet for all civilians. German women were not employed in the army, but large numbers took paid employment in industry and factories, and even larger numbers engaged in volunteer services. Housewives were taught how to cook without milk, eggs or fat. Agencies helped widows find work. Banks, insurance companies and government officers for the first time hired women for clerical positions. Factories hired them for unskilled labor. By December 1917, half the workers in chemicals, metals, and machine tools were women. Laws protecting women in the workplace were relaxed, and factories set up canteens to provide food for their workers, lest their productivity fall off. The food situation in 1918 was better, because the harvest was better, but serious shortages continued, with high prices, and a complete lack of condiments and fresh fruit. Many migrants had flocked into cities to work in industry, which made for overcrowded housing. Reduced coal supplies left everyone in the cold. Daily life involved long working hours, poor health, and little or no recreation, and increasing fears for the safety of loved ones in the army and in prisoner of war camp. The men who returned from the front were those who had been permanently crippled. Wounded soldiers who had recovered were sent back to the trenches.